Racist teacher throws hot water on black girl's afro hair. Not knowing her father was watching a teacher's reckless act leaves a student in tears, but her father's silent presence ensures this moment won't go unanswered. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The classroom at Lincoln High School was unusually quiet that Monday morning. Maya Thompson sat in her usual spot, third row from the front, trying to focus on her textbook while feeling Mrs. Johnson's disapproving stare. The tension had been building for weeks, but today felt different. Mrs. Johnson paced at the front of the classroom, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back, so tightly it seemed to stretch her facial features. Her wire-rimmed glasses sat low on her nose as she surveyed the classroom, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Today, we're discussing professional presentation," Mrs. Johnson announced, her voice carrying a sharp edge. Her eyes fixed on Maya's naturally styled afro. "Some of us clearly need this lesson more than others." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tom Martinez, sitting next to Maya, pretended to be deeply absorbed in his notebook. Sarah Chun, usually quick to participate, kept her eyes down. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken tension. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she continued taking notes. She'd spent years building confidence in her natural hair, encouraged by her father's stories of cultural pride. But Mrs. Johnson's constant comments had been chipping away at that confidence day by day. "Miss Thompson," Mrs. Johnson called out, her voice cutting through the silence. "Would you care to explain to the class why you insist on maintaining such an unprofessional appearance?" Before Maya could respond, Mrs. Johnson continued, "In the real world, such choices have consequences. No respectable establishment would hire someone who refuses to maintain a proper appearance." The other students' discomfort was palpable. Lucy Watson, Maya's best friend since middle school, clenched her fists under her desk. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of the increasingly hostile atmosphere. Mrs. Johnson walked to her desk, where a paper cup of tea had been sitting since the beginning of class. Steam still rose from its surface. The teacher's movements were deliberate, calculated, as she picked up the cup and walked toward Maya's desk. "Perhaps a demonstration is in order," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice eerily calm. "Sometimes, we need to learn the hard way about the importance of presenting ourselves appropriately." The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. Mrs. Johnson's hand tilted, and the hot tea arced through the air. Maya's scream pierced the classroom as the scalding liquid hit her hair and face, running down her neck and soaking into her white school shirt. Chairs scraped against the floor as students jumped up. Lucy rushed to Maya's side with paper towels. The classroom erupted into chaos. Some students ran for help, others stood frozen in shock, and a few pulled out their phones to record the incident. Outside in the hallway, Mr. Thompson, who had been heading to the main office to drop off some paperwork, heard his daughter scream. The sound stopped him in his tracks, his briefcase nearly slipping from his grip. The screams continued, mixed with the sounds of chaos from inside the classroom. The severity of what Mrs. Johnson had done hadn't yet fully registered with anyone in the room. Maya sat there, tears streaming down her face, her skin reddening where the hot tea had made contact. Her carefully maintained afro was now partially flattened and wet, drops of tea still running down her face and neck. The incident lasted less than a minute, but its impact would reshape the entire school community. As Mr. Thompson's footsteps approached the classroom door, no one inside could have predicted how this moment would catalyze a movement that would transform not just Lincoln High, but the entire district's approach to cultural acceptance and respect. Mr. Thompson burst through the classroom door, his usual composed demeanor shattered by the sight before him. The room had descended into chaos, but everything seemed to slow down when he saw Maya. His daughter sat at her desk, her clothes soaked, skin reddened, and tears streaming down her face. The smell of hot tea hung in the air. Students parted like a wave as he moved through the classroom, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. Lucy was still attempting to help Maya with paper towels, her own hands shaking. The rest of the class had pressed themselves against the walls, their phones lowered but still recording. witnesses to what would become a turning point in their school's history. "Baby girl," Mr. Thompson said softly, kneeling beside Maya's desk. His voice, usually strong and confident from years of civil rights advocacy, caught in his throat. He gently touched her arm, assessing the damage. The skin was angry red where the tea had made contact, and Maya flinched at his touch. Mrs. Johnson stood near her desk, her earlier bravado diminishing as she watched Mr. Thompson tend to his daughter. She straightened her blouse and cleared her throat. "Mr. Thompson, I can explain. This was merely a teachable moment about proper presentation and professional standards. Mr. Thompson didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge her words. His focus remained entirely on Maya, whose sobs had quieted to hiccups. He removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering the wet stains on her shirt. "I want to go home, Dad," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. The classroom's silence amplified her words, making them echo against the institutional white walls. Mrs. Johnson took a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor. "Now, Mr. Thompson, surely we can discuss this rationally. The school has certain standards. Again, he didn't respond. Instead, he helped Maya to her feet, keeping his jacket wrapped around her shoulders. The other students watched, their expressions a mix of shame and sympathy. Some looked down at their phones, already sharing what they'd recorded. Tom Martinez, who had been Maya's lab partner since freshman year, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Johnson threw hot tea on her, Mr. Thompson. It wasn't an accident. We all saw it." His voice cracked, but he stood straighter, emboldened by finally breaking the silence. Other students began nodding, murmuring in agreement. Sarah Chen raised her hand, then realized the futility of the gesture and simply spoke. "She's been making comments about Maya's hair all semester. We should have said something sooner." Mrs. Johnson's face reddened. "I will not be questioned about my teaching methods by students. This is about maintaining proper standards of appearance. My daughter," Mr. Thompson finally spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of years of fighting similar battles, "was assaulted in your classroom. That's what this is about." He still hadn't turned to face her, his attention focused on gathering Maya's belongings. Lucy helped collect Maya's notebooks and pens, her hands still shaking. "I recorded everything, Mr. Thompson," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Mrs. Johnson's attempts at justification had dwindled to nervous adjustments of her glasses and clothing. The other students remained pressed against the walls, but their phones were still out, still recording, ensuring that this moment wouldn't be forgotten or misconstrued later. Mr. Thompson finally stood to his full height, Maya's backpack in one hand, his other arm supporting his daughter. Only then did he turn to face Mrs. Johnson. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His expression, a mixture of control, anger, and determination, said everything necessary. As he guided Maya toward the door, the students parted again, creating a path. The bell rang, but no one moved. They watched as father and daughter left the classroom, leaving behind a heavy silence that would soon be broken by the storm of consequences about to unfold. The community center buzzed with tension as parents filled the wooden folding chairs. Mr. Thompson stood at the front of the room, his suit jacket replaced by a simple button-down shirt, the formality of his usual courtroom attire set aside for this grassroots gathering. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across concerned faces as he began to speak. "What happened to Maya isn't an isolated incident," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "It's a symptom of a deeper problem at Lincoln High." The room, packed with over 50 parents from various backgrounds, remained silent, waiting. Sarah Chen's mother, Dr. Chun, sat in the front row, her hospital scrubs still on from her shift. Next to her, Tom Martinez's parents leaned forward, their expressions grim. Lucy's mother, Mrs. Watson, who worked as a guidance counselor at a neighboring school, took notes on a legal pad. Mr. Thompson moved to the whiteboard, where he had written down incidents reported by other students and parents. The list was longer than anyone had expected. "These are just the cases we know about," he explained, tapping the marker against the board. "How many more students have suffered in silence?" As he spoke, parents began sharing their own stories. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, her voice shaking. My daughter came home crying last month because Mrs. Johnson said her accent made her sound uneducated. We told her to stay strong, to ignore it. Maybe we should have done more. The atmosphere in the room shifted as Mr. Thompson began sharing his own experiences. When I was in high school, he said, pacing slowly across the front of the room, my teacher told me I would never become a lawyer because I didn't look the part. I proved her wrong, but that memory never fades. Now, 30 years later, my daughter faces the same prejudice. The stories continued to flow. Dr. Chen revealed how her daughter Sarah had been afraid to wear traditional Chinese clothing on Cultural Day after Mrs. Johnson's comments about appropriate American attire. Mr. Jackson, whose son had graduated 2 years ago, described similar incidents during his son's time at Lincoln. Maya sat quietly in the back of the room, surrounded by her classmates who had chosen to attend. Lucy squeezed her hand as more parents stood up to speak. The students watched as their parents, many of whom they'd never seen take such public stands, found their voices. The school administration needs to understand this isn't just about one incident, Mr. Thompson continued. It's about creating an environment where every student feels safe and respected. He outlined a plan of action, including formal complaints, media involvement if necessary, and a demand for cultural sensitivity training. Parents began organizing themselves into committees. Mrs. Watson volunteered to document all incidents and coordinate with other school counselors. Mr. Martinez, who worked in local television, offered to handle media relations if needed. Dr. Chin promised to reach out to her contacts on the school board. The energy in the room transformed from anger to determination. Maya watched as her father, the man who had always fought battles in courtrooms and official meetings, now led a grassroots movement in their own community. She saw how her personal trauma was becoming a catalyst for change. We're not just fighting for Maya, Mr. Thompson concluded, his voice carrying the weight of purpose. We're fighting for every student who's ever felt diminished because of their culture, their appearance, or their identity. As the meeting drew to a close, parents exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. WhatsApp groups were created, and a follow-up meeting was scheduled. The community center's custodian, who had been listening while pretending to mop the floors, approached Mr. Thompson with his own story of discrimination at the school where his children attended. Maya felt something shift inside her as she watched the adults mobilize. The shame and humiliation from the incident began to transform into something else, a sense of purpose. Her father caught her eye from across the room and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the strength they were building together. The community had awakened, and Lincoln High would never be the same. The student lounge at Lincoln High transformed into an impromptu headquarters for what the students began calling Project Natural. Maya sat cross-legged on one of the worn couches, surrounded by a diverse group of classmates who had volunteered to help with the Cultural Awareness Initiative. Lucy worked on her laptop, creating a presentation about the historical significance of various cultural hairstyles. Tom Martinez, usually quiet in class, had become surprisingly vocal, sharing stories about his grandmother's struggles with cultural acceptance when she first immigrated. Sarah Chun designed posters that would later line the school hallways, each featuring students' personal stories alongside their photos. We need to make this bigger than just hair, Maya said, finding her voice growing stronger with each meeting. It's about accepting everyone's cultural identity. The group of 15 students nodded in agreement, some taking notes, others adding suggestions to the growing list on the whiteboard. Mr. Thompson attended these meetings not as a leader, but as an advisor. He sat in the corner, watching proudly as his daughter and her peers planned their event. When asked for input, he offered guidance on organization and presentation, drawing from his years of experience in civil rights advocacy. The key, he explained during one session, is to make it personal but universal. Share your stories, but connect them to the larger picture. The students absorbed his words, incorporating them into their planning. The project expanded beyond their initial concept. Students began bringing in photographs of their families, sharing stories of their cultural traditions. James Wilson, a quiet sophomore, brought in his grandfather's World War II medals, along with stories of how Black soldiers were treated upon returning home. Maria Gonzalez shared her Quinceañera photos, explaining the significance of the celebration in her culture. Maya and her team developed a structure for the event. They would begin with personal testimonies, followed by educational presentations about different cultural traditions. The centerpiece would be an exhibition called Our Hair, Our Stories, featuring photographs and narratives from students and their families. The preparation wasn't without challenges. Some students reported feeling pressured by their parents not to participate, fearing retaliation. Others worried about becoming targets themselves. But for each student who stepped back, 2 more stepped forward to help. During lunch breaks, the group practiced their presentations. Maya worked with younger students, helping them find the courage to share their experiences. The confidence she had lost during Mrs. Johnson's attack began to return, transformed into something stronger and more purposeful. Mr. Thompson watched as Maya helped a freshman rehearse her speech about wearing her hijab proudly despite facing discrimination. His daughter had inherited his passion for justice, but she was developing her own style of leadership, gentler than his courtroom approach, but equally effective. The project attracted attention from other teachers. Ms. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher, offered her classroom for additional meeting space. Mr. Bennett, who taught art, helped students create powerful visual displays for the event. Even the school librarian, Mrs. Patel, began curating a special collection of books about cultural diversity and acceptance. As the event date approached, the energy in the school shifted. Students who had never spoken to each other began having conversations about their backgrounds. The cafeteria seating arrangements, traditionally divided along social and cultural lines, began to blur. Maya stayed late after school most days, working with her team to perfect every detail. She created a timeline of historical events related to cultural discrimination and resistance, connecting their current struggle to a longer history of fighting for acceptance. Mr. Thompson observed all of this with a mixture of pride and caution. He knew the event would face opposition, particularly from those who had supported Mrs. Johnson's traditional views. But watching Maya and her peers work together, he saw something powerful emerging, a new generation finding its voice. The project had become more than just a response to one incident. It was evolving into a movement that would challenge the very culture of Lincoln High. As Maya often said during their planning sessions, "We're not just planning an event, we're creating change." The school administration's conference room felt suffocating despite its size. Principal Davis sat at the head of the long table, flanked by 2 school board members and the district's legal counsel. On the other side, Mr. Thompson sat with Maya and 3 other parents who had become instrumental in the movement. "While we understand your concerns," Principal Davis began, shuffling papers nervously, "implementing such widespread changes to our faculty training programs would require significant resources." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting unflattering shadows on everyone's faces. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his briefcase open beside him. Resources weren't a concern when the school implemented mandatory technology training last year, he noted, sliding a document across the table. "Our proposal costs less than that initiative." The legal counsel, Ms. Parker, examined the proposal with a frown. "Cultural sensitivity training is complex. There are liability issues to consider." She spoke in careful, measured tones, but her discomfort was evident. Dr. Chun, who had taken a day off from her hospital duties, interjected. "The real liability issue is having teachers who assault students because of their cultural expression." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Principal Davis winced. The proposal lay open on the table, a comprehensive training program for all faculty members, regular cultural awareness workshops, and the establishment of a diversity council comprising students, teachers, and parents. The budget was reasonable, the implementation timeline realistic. "We need to consider all perspectives," one of the board members offered weakly. Some parents support Mrs. Johnson's position on maintaining traditional standards. Maya, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Traditional standards according to whom?" Her voice was steady, stronger than anyone expected. "My natural hair is my tradition. Sarah's cultural celebrations are her tradition. Whose traditions are we really protecting?" The administrators exchanged uncomfortable glances. Principal Davis attempted to redirect the conversation. "Perhaps we could implement a smaller-scale program initially." "No," Mr. Thompson's response was firm. We're not looking for token gestures. The incident with Maya wasn't isolated, and you know it. He produced another document, a compilation of student testimonies, dates, and incidents spanning the past 5 years. The legal counsel reached for the document, but Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. We have videos, Mrs. Parker, recordings of multiple incidents. How do you think the media would respond to those? The threat wasn't explicit, but it was clear. The room grew tenser. One of the board members, Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to the student, spoke for the first time. What guarantee do we have that these changes would prevent future incidents? What guarantee do our children have of safety under the current system? Dr. Chin countered. The question lingered, unanswered. Principal Davis attempted to regain control of the meeting. We'll need time to review these proposals thoroughly. There are procedures to follow, budgets to consider. While you follow procedures, Maya interrupted, her voice trembling slightly but determined. Students are suffering. Every day you delay is another day someone feels unwelcome in their own school. The administrator's resistance was evident in their body language. Crossed arms, averted eyes, tight lips. They weren't ready to commit to significant changes, but they also couldn't dismiss the situation entirely. The meeting ended with vague promises to take the matter under advisement and explore possible solutions. As they gathered their materials to leave, Mr. Thompson locked eyes with Principal Davis. We'll give you 1 week to provide a concrete response. After that, we'll explore other options. Outside the conference room, Maya turned to her father. They're not going to do anything, are they? The frustration in her voice was palpable. Not willingly, Mr. Thompson replied, watching the administrators disperse through the hallway. But sometimes change needs a push. We've given them a chance to do the right thing voluntarily. Now we prepare for the next phase. The parents exchanged knowing looks. They had anticipated this resistance and had already begun preparing their response. The school's hesitation would only fuel the growing movement for change. The school auditorium buzzed with activity as Maya directed her team through another rehearsal. What had started as a small student initiative had grown into a full-scale production. Banners celebrating different cultural traditions hung from the walls, and student artwork filled every available space. The lighting needs to be stronger during the testimonials, Maya called out, her confidence growing with each passing day. She stood center stage, clipboard in hand, demonstrating how the previous victim of discrimination had transformed into a leader. Lucy managed the technical aspects, coordinating with the AV club to ensure each presentation would have maximum impact. We need to make sure everyone's voices carry to the back row, she insisted, adjusting microphone levels. Mrs. Johnson, passing by the auditorium doors, paused to watch. Her attempt to undermine the project had begun subtly, scheduling conflicts for rehearsal spaces, questioning the educational value of the program, suggesting it was divisive. But the students had anticipated each obstacle. Maya, Mrs. Johnson called out, her voice carrying across the space. This event is cutting into valuable study time. Your grades might suffer. The underlying threat was clear. Without missing a beat, Maya responded, My GPA is 3.9, Mrs. Johnson. I think I can manage both. Several students smirked, continuing their work. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone felt it. The rehearsals continued with renewed energy. Students practiced their speeches, sharing stories that had never been told within school walls. A sophomore described being told to Americanize her name. A junior revealed how he'd stopped wearing his traditional cultural clothing to avoid attention. Behind the scenes, Maya's team had created something remarkable. The event wasn't just about presentations. They had developed interactive exhibits where visitors could learn about different cultural traditions. They'd organized a gallery of family photographs showing cultural celebrations, traditional dress, and important moments in their community's histories. Mrs. Johnson hadn't given up. She approached individual parents, expressing concerns about their children's involvement. She suggested to the administration that the event might make some students uncomfortable. But her tactics backfired. Each attempt at interference only strengthened the students' resolve. She doesn't understand, Maya told her team during a break. This isn't just about what she did to me anymore. It's about making sure it never happens to anyone else. The students nodded, passing around water bottles and sharing snacks as they continued planning. The transformation in Maya was striking. The girl who had once sat silently through Mrs. Johnson's taunts now stood tall, directing her peers with quiet authority. She had found her voice, and it carried the weight of every student who had ever felt diminished in their own school. Mrs. Johnson made one final attempt to disrupt the project. She submitted a formal complaint to the administration, claiming the event promoted reverse discrimination and created a hostile environment for traditional values. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but the students had done their homework. They had documented every step of their planning, secured necessary permissions, and ensured their content met educational standards. More importantly, they had built a coalition of support that extended beyond the school walls. The day before the event, Maya gathered her team for a final review. The auditorium had been transformed. Student artwork covered the walls, video installations were ready, and the stage was set for the presentations that would challenge the school's status quo. Whatever happens tomorrow, Maya told her team, "We've already won. We found our voices. We stood up. That's something Mrs. Johnson can never take away from us." As they left the auditorium that evening, Mrs. Johnson watched from her classroom window. The momentum had shifted, and she knew it. The very students she had tried to silence were about to speak louder than ever. The morning of the event arrived with an electricity in the air. The school parking lot filled early, not just with students and parents, but with community members who had heard about the presentation. Local news vans parked along the street, their reporters setting up equipment. Maya stood backstage, her heart pounding. Through the curtain, she could see the auditorium filling beyond capacity. Extra chairs had been brought in, and still, people stood along the walls. Her father stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with other parents and community leaders who had supported the movement. Mrs. Johnson sat in the back row, her presence a reminder of why they were all there. She maintained her rigid posture, but her usual confidence seemed diminished by the sheer number of people who had come to support the students. "5 minutes, Maya," Lucy whispered, adjusting the microphone on Maya's collar. The backstage area bustled with activity as students made final preparations, straightened their clothes, and gave each other encouraging hugs. The lights dimmed, and Maya stepped onto the stage. The audience fell silent. Under the bright lights, she could barely make out individual faces, but she felt the collective energy of the crowd. "3 months ago," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I sat in a classroom where a teacher thought she had the right to define what beauty looks like, what professionalism looks like, what acceptance looks like." The audience held its breath. Maya continued, weaving together personal experience with broader themes of cultural identity and respect. She spoke about the history of discrimination, not with anger, but with determination for change. As she spoke, photographs appeared on the screen behind her, students from different cultural backgrounds, their stories, their traditions. The presentation unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Students took turns sharing their experiences, each story building upon the last. Tom Martinez described his grandmother's struggle to maintain her cultural identity. Sarah Chin spoke about the pride she now felt wearing traditional clothing to school events. In the audience, Mrs. Johnson's expression shifted from dismissive to uncomfortable as story after story revealed the impact of cultural insensitivity. Some of her former students were in attendance, and their presence seemed to weigh on her. The climax of the event came when Maya revealed the new student-led initiative, a permanent cultural awareness council that would work with faculty to prevent future incidents of discrimination. The announcement received a standing ovation. Mr. Thompson watched from the sidelines, tears in his eyes, as his daughter commanded the stage. The scared, humiliated girl from 3 months ago had transformed into a powerful advocate for change. After the formal presentations, the audience was invited to explore the interactive exhibits. Parents led discussions about their cultural traditions. Students demonstrated traditional dances, shared family recipes, and displayed artwork celebrating their heritage. The local news reporters interviewed students and parents, ensuring the message would reach beyond the school walls. The story wasn't just about one incident of discrimination anymore. It had become a movement for lasting change. Mrs. Johnson left before the event ended, slipping out quietly through a side door. Her departure went largely unnoticed as the celebration of diversity and acceptance continued without her. As the event drew to a close, Maya found herself surrounded by students, parents, and community members, all eager to share their own stories and offer support. The atmosphere had transformed from one of protest to one of celebration. "This is just the beginning," Maya told a reporter who asked about her plans. "We're not just talking about change anymore, we're making it happen." The media coverage spread like wildfire across the local news networks. "Student stands up against cultural discrimination," read the headlines. Maya's story, combined with a successful cultural awareness event, caught the attention of larger news outlets, and soon the pressure on Lincoln High intensified. The school's hallways buzzed with activity as reporters conducted interviews between classes. Students who had never spoken up before began sharing their experiences with Mrs. Johnson. It started as a trickle, then became a flood of testimonies spanning her 15-year tenure at the school. "She told me my accent would hold me back in life," admitted Jennifer Rodriguez, now a college sophomore, speaking to a local news station. "I spent years in speech therapy trying to erase my heritage." Other alumni began reaching out through social media, sharing similar stories. Mrs. Johnson attempted to maintain her composure as cameras followed her from her car to the school entrance. "My methods may be strict, but they prepare students for the real world," she insisted to reporters. Her words, however, rang hollow against the mounting evidence of systematic discrimination. The school's social media accounts were flooded with messages from former students. Some shared decade-old incidents that still haunted them. Others posted photos of themselves in successful careers, proudly displaying the cultural characteristics Mrs. Johnson had criticized. "I saw the video of what happened to Maya," wrote James Chun, a former student now working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. "The same thing happened to my sister in 2012. We were too afraid to speak up then. Not anymore." Mrs. Johnson's attempts to defend herself only made things worse. In an ill-advised interview with a local newspaper, she claimed she was helping students adapt to professional standards. When asked whose standards, she struggled to provide a coherent answer. The pressure began affecting her teaching. Students noticed her hands shaking as she wrote on the whiteboard. Her once authoritative voice wavered during lectures. The power dynamic had shifted. Irreversibly, former colleagues started distancing themselves. Teachers who had once supported her traditional approach now spoke openly about instances they'd witnessed but ignored. The faculty lounge, once her domain, became an uncomfortable space. "I should have said something years ago," admitted Mr. Roberts, a veteran English teacher, to the school board. "We all saw it happening. We just convinced ourselves it wasn't our problem to solve." The local chapter of the NAACP requested a meeting with the school board. Civil rights organizations began examining Lincoln High's disciplinary records, looking for patterns of discriminatory behavior. Each investigation uncovered more evidence supporting the students' complaints. Mrs. Johnson's final attempt at damage control backfired spectacularly. She released a statement claiming she was being targeted for maintaining high standards. Within hours, social media exploded with photos of successful professionals wearing natural hairstyles, traditional clothing, and cultural accessories. The school administration found itself caught between mounting public pressure and potential legal liability. Every new testimony added weight to the case against Mrs. Johnson, while also raising questions about the administration's long-term failure to address the issue. Maya watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "It was never about destroying Mrs. Johnson," she explained to a documentary crew filming the story. "It was about destroying the system that made her behavior acceptable for so long." As the media spotlight intensified, Mrs. Johnson's position became increasingly untenable. Her classroom, once full of intimidated silence, now held students who met her gaze with quiet confidence, phones ready to record any inappropriate comments. The emergency school board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. The gymnasium, converted into a makeshift assembly hall, was packed beyond capacity. Community members lined the walls, many holding signs supporting Maya and demanding institutional change. Mr. Thompson sat in the front row beside Maya, both dressed formally for the occasion. The table at the front held 9 voting members of the school board, Principal Davis, and the district superintendent. Mrs. Johnson sat alone at a small table to the side, her attorney whispering in her ear. "We're here to vote on the continued employment of Mrs. Sarah Johnson," announced Board President Williams, her voice echoing through the PA system. "Before we proceed, we'll hear final statements from all parties involved." The evidence presented was overwhelming. Videos of the tea incident played on large screens. Documents showed a pattern of complaints spanning years. Former students' testimonies were read aloud, each one adding weight to the case against Mrs. Johnson. Maya's testimony came last. She stood at the podium, her voice clear and unwavering. "This isn't just about one incident or one teacher," she stated. "It's about the culture that allowed these actions to continue for years. Every time we stayed silent, we became part of the problem." The tension in the room was palpable as Mrs. Johnson approached the podium for her defense. Her usual confidence had crumbled, replaced by a desperate attempt to justify her actions. "I was preparing them for the real world," she insisted, her voice breaking. "These standards exist whether we like them or not." "Whose standards?" called out a voice from the crowd. Mrs. Johnson couldn't answer. The board members began their deliberation. Each member had to publicly state their position and reasoning. The first vote came in against Mrs. Johnson, then another, and another. Some board members spoke about liability concerns. Others focused on the documented pattern of discrimination. A few admitted their own culpability in allowing the situation to continue for so long. Mrs. Johnson watched as her career unraveled vote by vote. Her attorney S. scribbled notes frantically, but they both knew where this was heading. The damage was irreparable. The final tally was 7-2 in favor of termination. The decision was effective immediately. Mrs. Johnson would be escorted to collect her belongings the following day. As the verdict was announced, the gymnasium erupted in applause. But Maya didn't celebrate. She watched Mrs. Johnson gather her papers with trembling hands, saw the moment reality set in on her former teacher's face. The crowd began to disperse, but the real work was just beginning. The board also voted to implement the comprehensive cultural sensitivity training program that Mr. Thompson had proposed. A diversity council would be established, with Maya invited to serve as a founding member. Mrs. Johnson made her way toward the exit, former colleagues turning away as she passed. Her last attempt at dignity crumbled when she reached the doors. Former students stood there, not blocking her path, but their presence was a silent testimony to years of endured discrimination. As she left Lincoln High for the last time, Mrs. Johnson finally understood what Maya had tried to explain during the cultural awareness event, that true education isn't about erasing differences, but celebrating them. The evening ended with more than just a termination. It marked the beginning of systematic change at Lincoln High, changes that would ensure no student would ever again feel ashamed of their cultural identity within those walls. 6 months after Mrs. Johnson's departure, Lincoln High had transformed. The once rigid hallways now displayed student artwork celebrating cultural diversity. Classroom discussions openly addressed issues of identity and acceptance. The change wasn't just cosmetic, it was fundamental. Maya and Mr. Thompson found themselves at the center of developing the school's new cultural awareness curriculum. They worked alongside educators, community leaders, and diversity experts to create a program that would become a model for other schools in the district. The goal isn't just tolerance, Maya explained during a regional education conference. It's understanding and celebration. Her speech received a standing ovation, and representatives from neighboring districts requested copies of Lincoln High's new programs. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson's story took a different turn. Her attempts to find employment at other schools were met with closed doors. Videos of the tea incident had gone viral, making her name synonymous with institutional discrimination. Former students continued to share their stories on social media, creating a digital record of her impact. She made one last attempt at redemption, applying to teach at a private academy known for its traditional values. But even they couldn't ignore the controversy. Her interview ended abruptly when a parent recognized her name and raised concerns. Back at Lincoln High, the changes continued. The new Diversity Council, with Maya as its student chair, implemented monthly cultural celebration events. Students who had once hidden their cultural identities now proudly shared their traditions. The school cafeteria offered diverse meal options, and morning announcements were sometimes made in multiple languages. Mr. Thompson watched his daughter flourish in her new role. The trauma of that day with the tea had transformed into something powerful, a movement that extended beyond Lincoln High's walls. Maya received invitations to speak at educational conferences, sharing her story and the importance of cultural acceptance in schools. The final nail in Mrs. Johnson's professional coffin came when several of her former students, now successful professionals, created a scholarship fund for minority students at Lincoln High. They named it the Cultural Pride Scholarship, a direct challenge to everything she had stood for. Maya's initiative caught the attention of state education officials. They began using Lincoln High's program as a template for cultural sensitivity training across the state. The very standards Mrs. Johnson had tried to enforce were being replaced by new ones, standards that celebrated diversity rather than suppressing it. 1 year after the incident, during a special assembly, Maya stood on the same stage where she had once given her first speech. The auditorium was filled with new faces, but the energy was familiar. She spoke about transformation, about the power of standing up, about the importance of preserving cultural identity. As for Mrs. Johnson, she was last seen substitute teaching at a small private school 2 states away, where her past eventually caught up with her. Her former students, now parents themselves, made sure their children would never experience what they had endured. The story of Lincoln High became a case study in educational journals. Articles discussed how one incident of discrimination, rather than breaking a student's spirit, had catalyzed lasting institutional change. Maya's approach, focusing on education and celebration rather than punishment, was praised as a model for addressing systemic discrimination. Mr. Thompson, watching his daughter address another conference of educators, reflected on how far they'd come. The scared girl who had come home with tea-soaked clothes had transformed into a powerful advocate for change. More importantly, she had shown others how to transform their own pain into progress. The final irony came when Mrs. Johnson's traditional standards became the subject of a doctoral thesis on institutional discrimination. Her name would be remembered, but not in the way she had hoped. Instead, she became a cautionary tale about the cost of refusing to embrace change and diversity. Maya's last speaking engagement of the year ended with a question that summed up everything. What would you say to Mrs. Johnson now? Maya's response was simple. Thank you for teaching me the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest change comes from the deepest wounds.